What is entrepreneurship? It's the risk that arises from bad business model design. This E4E podcast points entrepreneurs in the right direction.
This is the Economics for Entrepreneurs podcast, a project of the Mises Institute, applying the principles of economics to start, grow, and manage your business. For free tools, resources, key takeaways, and actionable insights from each episode, visit Mises.org/E4E-pod. Now, here's Hunter Hastings.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. It goes without saying that we believe deeply in entrepreneurship here at the Economics for Entrepreneurs podcast. We believe in the power of entrepreneurship as action to energize economic growth and a better society, in its influence at the level of the individual firm for innovation and business success, and in entrepreneurship as a lifestyle choice for its purpose, meaning, and autonomy for individuals. Why do we think economics has a role to play? One reason is that economics focuses entrepreneurs on the levers of success, and that a non-economic approach, one that's based on fatty business school advice, for example, or personality-driven anecdotes or misinterpreted case studies, can lead business owners and managers astray. We have a name for these erroneous business models: entrepreneurship. For example, when you hear or see terms such as entrepreneurs are adept at exploiting market gaps, you should immediately be wary. There are no market gaps and no opportunities until business writers recognize them after the fact. They're not out there staring you in the face. You can't identify them with analysis. And that's just one example of entrepreneurial error. It's the wrong focus. And you can easily see how dangerous and costly it can be to chase an opportunity that's not there. Our guide through the pitfalls of entrepreneurship today is a familiar voice, Per Bylund. He is unflinching in his examination of what works and what doesn't in entrepreneurship, and he's been the foremost proponent of the ultimate business model, the Austrian customer-first model. He teaches economics and entrepreneurship at Oklahoma State University and online at entrepreneur.com, Twitter, and Mises.org. Per, welcome again to Economics for Entrepreneurs.
Thanks for having me again.
Well, thank you. We recently talked with you about what you call the entrepreneurial ethic, the drive for entrepreneurs to help others, to empathize with them and their dissatisfactions, and to bring them solutions for those dissatisfactions. They're rewarded by profit, which is a market signal that they're using resources well and should continue to do so. So please recap that ethic for us as our starting point today.
Sure, absolutely. So it's really about serving others rather than trying to serve yourself. I mean, that's obviously when we do something, we do it for a reason, and that reason, I mean, that motivation or whatever it is we're doing is something that we cherish in some sense. So in that sense, I mean, starting a business or being an entrepreneur is for yourself, but the best way of doing it and the way to properly do it so that you do benefit yourself as much as possible is to serve others. So the entrepreneurial ethic is not to focus on production for yourself, but is focusing on solving problems for others or making sure that their lives are better, increase the well-being of your consumers or your customers. And that should be the focus, because that is how you increase and maybe even maximize your revenue so that you can then cover your costs and earn a profit.
And that's a fundamental point about the Austrian view of entrepreneurship. It strikes me it changes everything. It changes the theory of entrepreneurship. It changes behavior, how entrepreneurs act. It's the purpose of entrepreneurship. It changes the economics. It delivers the social benefits, but it changes our thinking about social benefits. So its progress and its growth, all of that comes from the core purpose of the entrepreneur, to serve the consumer. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, if you want to refer to some of the Austrian thinkers, then Mises talked about the economy not as a system or as a state or as a structure, but as a process. And it's a process that is driven by entrepreneurship, because entrepreneurs are in the business of figuring out how to serve other people in the best way possible. And sometimes economists and economics is sort of looked down upon for recognizing that resources are scarce, and that we need to consider the trade-offs and the opportunity cost, what we're giving up when we're pursuing something. But the point is that we have so many things that we would want, and so many things that we want to do, and so many ways of making our lives better. But the resources we have are limited, considered from the point of view of what we might want to do. And since we have these scarce resources in that sense, we need to figure out better ways of serving one another and better ways of serving people in general. And that role is the role of the entrepreneur.
You've used the word to serve a lot, Per, serving and service. And I just like to put that under the microscope a little bit. It's so relevant to modern economics. There's a whole literature about service systems. It's a high-tech kind of literature now because computing and code are so integral to delivering service. And the point of service is to facilitate a feeling on the part of the recipient of the service, that they feel that they've had good service, they feel satisfied, they feel better. So it's a lot different than the old thinking of what they used to call goods dominant logic, I think, which you're not selling stuff to people, you're delivering a service to make them feel better.
Absolutely. And it's a much broader definition of what it is that you're doing. And there have been historic debates about whether advertising adds value and things like that, and packaging and things like that. And very often, from an environmentalist point of view, for instance, we would like to minimize packaging for products. But everything that you put into producing and delivering a product to a customer and communicating that it's there and what it can be used for is part of the experience that you're selling to the consumer. And that is what is going to be valued as a package. So when you're selling, say, a toothpaste or something like that, whether it comes in a little box or not, it does not matter so much for the function of toothpaste, but it matters for the customer because they will pick up whatever toothpaste they fancy the most. If there's a color that they like more, if there is a message on the packaging that they agree with, if it's placed on a certain shelf, and all of these things really matter when you pick that toothpaste up at the store or if you order it online. And all of these things are part of the consumer experience. It's not only when you brush your teeth or when you go to the dentist and realize that you have no cavities. I mean, that's the function of the product, but what you're buying is not only the product, it's the whole thing.
And the consumer can send back signals if their preferences change or their dissatisfaction increases. I as a consumer, might feel uncomfortable for whatever reason that you're using too much packaging, which makes me think that you're cutting down too many trees or you're not treating the earth in a friendly fashion. If that's my personal feeling, I can send that signal back and the entrepreneur responds in the system we're talking about, correct?
Absolutely. And there was even a campaign in Europe many years ago now when consumers were asked to leave unnecessary packaging in the store. I mean, that's a very strong signal, right? You buy the toothpaste and everybody just leaves the box with a cashier. I mean, that's a lot of hassle for the store, of course, but it's also a very strong signal to them that stop selling toothpaste with a box. And they will, of course, tell their supplier that we don't want the box anymore because we're just left with a bunch of boxes. So sell us the toothpaste only and not the additional box, right? But the strongest signal that you can send is to simply not buy, or rather to buy something else, right? In a sense that we've addressed this before, that as an entrepreneur, when you're offering an experience, or that is based around a good, you're not competing with only everybody else offering similar goods. You're competing with everything else that the consumer considers alternatives for the use of their money. So you have to offer them a really good deal, which means that if you do not, they will spend their money elsewhere. And that is sort of a failure, especially if it's a customer that you have targeted and tried to really provide them with value, and they choose something else. That's a very strong signal that you failed. They prefer something else, which means you have to do something differently.
So this is the Austrian way of thinking, that the entrepreneur's task is to serve the customer well. The customer's role is to send back those signals that they approve or disapprove, they are pleased or they're not pleased. The emergent result from that is profit or loss. And that's where this idea of co-creation of value comes in, that the customer is a participant in the creation of value. But I think your concern, Per, moving to it now, is that there's a lot of misunderstanding in the world, in the general literature, and the culture about the entrepreneurial purpose. That sometimes is negative and it's troubling, and it could be used to damage the institution of entrepreneurship, how society understands it. Tell us about your concerns and how you voice them.
Well, I mean, the problem is really, I guess it has its origin with people thinking of profit as something that is exploitation. And I mean, in a market setting, we know that this is not the case. And if you then teach people to maximize profits and that you're running a business for yourself primarily, and the point is sort of to create an empire. And we see this, we read this in the MBA courses and so forth, how the empire making of businesses and so forth. That it's about growing, it's about becoming powerful and large and all of these things in the economy. And it's about scale, it's about growing fast, and it's taking over the market. And it's about, we even use military terms, which suggest that it's some kind of fight, that it's a war against other businesses, and maybe even war against your employees and your customers perhaps as well, which is very destructive, because everything we're talking about on this podcast and that Austrian economics teaches is that it's not a war at all. It's really cooperation. So when you are made better off from your efforts if you target them to serve others. And there's no way you can think of serving one another as a war. And it's also not exploitation. Exploitation is something different, and it's something that should be foreign from sort of true or pure market action. So very often when we talk about these businesses that do not really consider the value for the customer, but they consider how to scale, and they look to themselves first, and they look at cutting costs and maybe even cutting corners. I mean, I wouldn't call this entrepreneurship. I would call this entrepreneurship, UN, not EN.
Mm-hmm. And as you say, that sentiment that perhaps is learned in school or learned in business school or peddled by business book writers and business consultants is potentially highly damaging to our system.
Absolutely. I mean, one way that it is being taught, it seems like the assumption is that there is a certain amount of profit available in the economy, and it's up to you to be really fast and get there really quick, and then just take as much as possible of this bag of money profits and then run away. And if you don't, then someone else will do it. Well, there's no such thing as limited profits. Profits arise out of creating something that is of value to consumers. So if you facilitate value to consumers, they will reward you by paying a price for it. And the more value you provide them with, the higher price they will pay, which means you have even more profits or can reinvest or whatever it is you want to do with the money. But there's no such thing as limited profit, and there's no such thing as limited opportunities. And the best way of competing is not to cut corners and undermine the other guy, but to figure out your own niche and figure out how you can provide additional unique value to consumers by making their lives better.
So when we see the business book Rhetoric about exploiting a market or filling a gap or seizing an opportunity, all of those are erroneous language compared to serving the consumer.
Yeah, they are. And I mean, in a sense, yeah, you're filling a gap in the sense that no one else has done this before. But it puts focus on you and other businesses as what is important. And then the consumer is sort of secondhand. And the gap implies that, just because someone else has not done this before, it should be done. Well, there's no such thing as it should be done just because it hasn't been done before. But that doesn't make any sense. What should be the guiding light is the value for consumers, which means a gap would simply be that, hey, there's a lot of value potential here that no one has figured out before, so I should do that. But it doesn't make any sense to talk about this as a gap in the market. And it's possible. I mean, it's even intuitive to think about it this way. If you start a business and you consider sort of the competitive landscape around you, it makes sense to think about it in sort of hostile terms, that if you do not have competitors, if you have a blue ocean strategy when you start a business, then that's probably easier than to figure out exactly how you can profit from the business. And it is really hard to run a business. But the point is not to find where others are not, but to provide more value. Because you can enter a market or an industry where there are plenty of other producers and plenty of other entrepreneurs, and they're competitive like crazy. And you enter that industry and you can completely undermine the whole industry by offering greater value.
A quick insert here. We are talking with Per Bylund about the potential errors of entrepreneurial business models. We favor the Austrian model that redefines value creation for today's world and systematically assembles the right value-producing components and markets the right benefits. You can follow this business model via the Austrian Entrepreneur's Journey, our step-by-step online course for business builders at e4epod.com/journey. That's the letter E, the number 4, the letter E, pod.com/journey. And now back to Per. So I tried to do some research of examples or maybe instances of entrepreneurship, UNtrepreneurship, and I started with your focus on what the economists call consumer sovereignty, that the entrepreneur should have a singular focus on the most productive ways to facilitate what the consumer determines as value. And then if you look through the literature, there's a lot of focus on other things. One that I'm familiar with is returns to venture capital. So you're focused on the level of return as opposed to the satisfaction of consumers. Even shareholder value is not consumer sovereignty, and certainly private equity returns are not consumer sovereignty. So there's one place where the focus is maybe misplaced.
It is, and it's sort of like Western medicine compared to Eastern medicine, if I may use that as an analogy, where in the Western medicine, we treat the symptoms and not the disease, or at least not the cause of the disease. And in the same sense, we focus on maximizing return on investment, ROI, on whatever the investment is, rather than looking at what is this actually a symptom, quote unquote, of? Well, the return on investment is a signal from the whole marketplace that your investment has benefited consumers much more than other people's investments. That's what it means. That consumers have willingly paid a whole lot more for the goods that you produced, and you were able to keep your costs low enough to get a high return on investment. So it makes you a good entrepreneur in two senses. One, you figured out how to make consumers' lives better. And two, you were able to keep your costs very low. But focusing only on ROI, that sort of directs your attention to cost cutting rather than value maximizing. And that is, as we've talked about before, that's backwards. You should always start with value. And if you start cost cutting without having considered how to value maximize first, then your business is already going down the tubes. You've already reached your peak in a sense. You should always focus on the value and think of the costs later. And I don't mean by that, I mean, many entrepreneurs listening to this are probably thinking, what the heck is he talking about? Because they know that cash flow is hard, but then if you don't manage your costs, you're screwed, right? So then you suffer losses and you lose your business. That is true, but the way to cover the cost is to think of the value first. So if you produce immense value for consumers, they will reward you by paying a higher price. Your job is to keep costs below that price. But if you haven't considered the value first, you're not getting the price you should get because you're targeting the wrong consumer. You're having the wrong product, the wrong message. You're providing the wrong experience to the wrong people. And that's simply the wrong way of doing it. Costs should facilitate the product and the experience that you're offering, but you shouldn't assume that experience and that product, which usually is, I mean, you're not even focusing on the experience, focusing on the physical product very often. And then you take that as a given and you just focus on cutting costs somehow. Let's make it quicker, let's make it cheaper, and then just produce the same thing. Well, I mean, that's a commodity market where everybody's focusing on producing the same thing, like producing grains or something like that. That's not where you want to enter as an entrepreneur. That's not even entrepreneurship. That's management. It's very different. You already have a business. You already have a business purpose. You have a business aim. You have a strategy. Everything is in place. Then all you need to do is manage the production process. Well, entrepreneurship is not about managing an existing production process. It's about figuring out what the heck should we produce and how and for whom.
We use the word value a lot, Per, and we have a specific entrepreneurial understanding of that it's subjective value. It's in the mind of the consumer. They determine what value is. We as entrepreneurs are trying to ascertain that and cater to it. But that word value is used in the rhetoric of business in a much different sense. So the business school literature talks about value creation, which is firm-centric. It means that the firm creates value. And I think your message is that is not the case. If you think that you're, as a firm, are creating value, you talk about adding value, that's missing the point and getting the process backward, as you say, that the consumer is the one that creates value.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, in a sense, this is splitting hairs because, you want to create value for the customer so that the experience is as good as possible. And you want to create value for yourself in terms of the profit that you're making. But the problem there is that you're mixing different things. So the value for the consumer is not really something that you control. It's not even something that you can measure. It's something that happens completely within the consumer. And I mean it in the consumer's own mind. The satisfaction he or she gets from the whole experience of buying and using your product or service. That is the value that we want to accomplish. That in turn sets an upper limit to how much purchasing power they want to part with when they buy your product. And of course, the greater the difference between the value, the satisfaction they get, and that they get from however they choose to use your product, and the expected satisfaction they could get by buying something else with that money, that's their gain. That's their profit, quote unquote. Right? So, but that price it's only limited by the value that is going to be created. That price is not the value at all. This price is what you get in return for having produced something that facilitates the value for the consumer. And then, of course, your job is in the objective realm where everything is in money terms, where you can calculate your revenue in terms of the quantity of goods sold and the price per good. That's your revenue. And then you have all your inputs and all the costs. That's also in dollar amounts, meaning you can easily calculate what the profit is. Did you do a good job or did you do a bad job? How good a job did you actually do with this? And that's the ROI that we talked about just a minute ago. That if you have a return on investment that is lower than most other entrepreneurs, you're not doing a good job. If you have an ROI that is higher than other entrepreneurs, you're doing a good job for consumers, right? And for the economy overall. That's what it means. And that for that you are being rewarded. The problem is when you're mixing these, thinking of value in objective terms for both the business and for the consumer, or even worse, simply excluding the consumer, thinking of the economy and your market, quote unquote, in terms of how much revenue you can extract, and thinking of pricing of the product as how much can we jack up the price to get as much revenue as possible, which is also backwards because you set a price to make or price tag to make the good appear as valuable as possible in value terms for the consumer. So if the consumer gains a lot, they would be more than willing to pay the price. But if they don't gain a lot, so if you look at their willingness to pay and you maximize, you set the price on your price tag to exactly their willingness to pay, it's not going to be a very good deal for them because they're not willing to pay 1 cent more, which means that they profit very little from your product. They will get more value than the money they give up, sure, but not a whole lot more. If you provide the good at a much lower price, their profit will be higher. They will be more loyal customers. They will like you more because the experience was worth so much more than the cost to them.
I remember reading in Human Action, Per, that Mises emphasizes that the consumer creates everything, as you say, prices, exchange, employment and unemployment, productive and unproductive investments. It's all the result of consumer action and consumer choice, and as you say, buying and not buying. It's a very hard discipline to wrap your mind around. Maybe because we haven't been taught that way, but it's really hard to keep reminding yourself that that's how the market system works.
Right. I mean, the whole economy is about using the scarce resources that we have in such a way that as many people as possible get as much benefit as possible out of it. Right? And figuring that out is the role of the entrepreneurs. That's where we started out our discussion today.
Mm-hmm.
So saying that the consumer is sort of secondary or thinking of the consumer as a party to exploit for revenue and things like that is completely backwards. The whole point of the economy is to benefit the consumer. And if that is your role as an entrepreneur, which it is, then you should also focus on doing that because that's how you carry out your role as well as possible. And that's also how you profit from it because there are no contradictions in this type of system, in the market system.
Another idea that comes to us from business schools in Silicon Valley and maybe some other places is this whole concept of scaling, scalability. I've even seen the terms hyperscale and hyperscaling, which seems to me is not the Austrian productivity idea of economizing in the most efficient way of using resources to produce consumer benefits, as you just described. It's about, my notes to myself say, voracious use of resources that might not be right for the most efficient use of the most efficient allocation. So scaling becomes the objective as opposed to benefit to consumers.
Right. And I wonder if this is somehow based on the illusion that size is power. And I mean, many of us think in that way, like, oh, a big business, they're basically too big to fail, right? And it's not about getting buyouts from the government or anything like that. But if they're really big, it's really hard to compete with them because we think in terms of economies of scale, and we really think about the production processes and the costs of production. But the point is that the economy is not a bunch of factories. Manufacturing is necessary for a lot of the services we provide consumers with, the experiences that they get. But it's not about managing production processes. That's not the point. So scaling, like I mentioned just a minute ago, being big and seeming to be powerful in any industry doesn't help you at all unless you produce something that is of value to consumers. And we see these more and more, and the more dynamic the market is, the more examples we get, that you have startups with a new way of doing things or a new type of product completely that just completely crushes all the big incumbents. So the huge corporations that are already in this market, they're already supplying goods and services to customers, and they're doing, it seems, a good job. They're raking in profits and all this stuff. And then having an idea and implementing that idea in a good way for the consumers could mean that this giant just falls apart. Why? Because you're focusing on the value for the consumer. But if you try to compete with these corporations by managing the production process better than that's impossible. So this whole scaling business, I mean, sure, there are economies of scale. So you can get a lower average cost of production if you increase output. That's, yes, of course, but you have to put value first, because even if you just keep cutting costs, someone else producing something else will potentially completely pull out the rug from under you.
Yeah. I remember also from Human Action that Mises has a phrase about certain economic actors and firms preferring to insulate themselves from the vagaries of the market, I think he called it, which too big to fail is obviously that you're not willing to subject yourself to the changed preferences of consumers. But I wonder whether venture capital pools do that sometimes. So if you've got $10 billion from SoftBank that will last you for the next 5 years, you don't have to face the vagaries of the market. You don't have to make a profit. You can use pricing as leverage instead of price as discovery, and you're insulated in some way. Is that a form of entrepreneurship, do you think?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, obviously, any business would need some form of investment to get started. So, but getting too much investment and getting a whole bag of cash, more than you need to get started, I mean, that just means that you don't have to economize. You don't have to figure out the best way of doing things. And you are not subject to scarce resources in a sense, right? Because you have all this money. Well, we talked about before how the role of the entrepreneur is really to figure out how to make as much benefit and value as possible for consumers in a world of only scarce resources. But then someone hands you a huge bag of money, meaning you can just spend it any way you like. And then you will spend it on all kinds of crazy stuff that does not necessarily benefit the consumer. And without thinking about ROI and things like that, even though hopefully the venture capitalists will require some ROI at some point. But it's also the case that venture capitalists they're in the business of speculation. I mean, they need one giant success to cover the losses of hundreds of failures. So they're basically buying into you as an entrepreneur rather than anything else. And if there's a lot of cheap money around, they can throw money around too. and they can give you a big bag of money. And there is a bunch of research on how slack resources sort of makes you lazy or makes businesses lazy and less innovative overall. Of course, it doesn't mean that everybody stops innovating. It means that in general, overall, the average business, if there is such a thing, would innovate less, and they would be less responsive to what they learn about consumers and what consumers might actually want. If you don't have to think as much about the value you create and how to keep your costs below that value, you are starting to work and also organize the business for yourself more than for the consumer. And that again is the opposite of what entrepreneurs should do from the point of view of the functioning of the economic system and from the point of view of profitability.
Yep. Per, let's just cover one more aspect of entrepreneurship that we've mentioned before. So we don't need to go into full detail of your exposition, but it's the idea about social impact investing or social entrepreneurship. And that makes it sound like entrepreneurship is not normally socially contributive or not adequately contributive, whereas the whole point about the entrepreneurial ethic and what we've been talking about today is to improve as many lives as possible. That's what entrepreneurship does. So social entrepreneurship is a self-contradiction. Is that the right way to say it?
I think that is the right way to say it. It's sort of based on this view that somehow making a profit is a bad thing, and if you make a profit, you're exploiting something, and it's better morally, ethically to be generous with your time and give stuff away to other people. It's not good if you get something in return, right? So it's like a Christmas present, whether you get one or not, you should give other people a Christmas present, then you're good. But if you sign a contract or if you exchange with someone, then it's not ethically, it's not a good thing. And the more we learn about entrepreneurship and what entrepreneurs actually do in the economy, where their job is to figure out how to satisfy people in the best way possible, and people will pay them for the trouble in a sense, and then they get something in as well. There's no contradiction here. There's no exploitation. The profit that you earn as an entrepreneur is simply a signal from consumers overall saying that, hey, you did a really good job using our scarce resources to provide us with satisfaction. Well, I mean, what is more social than that? And then as a contrast, social entrepreneurship would be you provide something to people that you think that they need. But since they're not paying for what you're providing, there's no feedback. There's no signal that you're doing something that is right in itself. And there's also no feedback saying whether you do it in the right way. So it's since you're lacking these signals, since there is no payment for it, nothing in return, and therefore also no choice, because they're just accepting something for free, there's no economizing, which means it is very unlikely that you do something in the proper way. So your use of resources that could be used to satisfy people and directed by these signals, the likelihood that you figure out exactly the right way of doing it when you do not have the signals and you don't need to care about the signals, it is practically zero, which means from an economic point of view, from the system point of view, it's a waste of resources.
Right. There is one more way, I think, Per, you may correct me, that the anti-market, anti-entrepreneurship rhetoric goes in the wrong direction, and that's what I'd call entrepreneur envy. So as Austrians, we tend to humanize the entrepreneur as hero because they create growth and better service to consumers in the marketplace. Often there's a sacrifice for that. They might take a lower salary than they need to or use up their savings while they're assembling resources to take their idea to market. They're a humble servant in that idea. But often in the popular view, the entrepreneur is Jeff Bezos. He's the billionaire. And they only see him at the top of the J curve, not the bottom. And they only see that entrepreneur as an over-consuming exploiter as opposed to a humble servant. So I think we want to maintain the idea of entrepreneur as hero, but it's the humble servant hero as opposed to the billionaire hero.
Right, because we're looking at the outcome only. So you would hear comments like, no one is worth whatever Bezos is worth, or rather his company is worth. So say it's $40 billion or whatever. No one is worth that much. And at the same time, of course, a life is invaluable. But we don't see all these startups and the struggling, the sacrifices made in order to figure out how to actually provide consumers with value. Most entrepreneurs fail most of the time. And these are failures that don't simply mean that, oh, no, I'm not going to be the Jeff Bezos of tomorrow. It means, whoops, I lost my livelihood and I lost everything I put into this business. So it's a disaster. It could be for this person or the people in the business. But every business has to basically go through this in order to figure out how to properly position their efforts to thereby satisfy consumers to the greatest possible degree. And big companies, they have simply been successful in doing that from a market perspective, or they have played the political game and kept others out and exploited that system. So, I mean, there are both sides to the story. But from a market perspective, you only make money as an entrepreneur if you provide consumers with sufficient value, and sufficient being more than other entrepreneurs. So if someone makes a ton of money, it means that they have contributed a lot of good things. Instead, we tend to look at only the few very successful entrepreneurs, and we look at them at their zenith, when they are at the peak of their efforts. They have businesses that are worth a lot of money because everybody can see that they're doing good things. And then we tend to compare what they make in salaries or in terms of the value of owning that business, which is nowhere near the same thing as having that as cash, and compare that to the workers doing the job, right? So since you mentioned Bezos, in Amazon, people would compare what Bezos owns in terms of money value of owning Amazon with how much is made by people packing boxes in Amazon warehouses. Well, those people would not have a job if it were not for Amazon being a business, of course. But it's completely unfair comparison as well, because you can apply for a job in Amazon and start packing boxes tomorrow, say if they have an opening, and then make money from day one. Whereas the entrepreneur who starts a business starts in the negative and probably cannot get a salary or anything like that for a very long time, and then potentially makes money. But that could take years. So we need to compare the processes and the income they earn over time, but also consider what it is that they're actually contributing. Because someone packing boxes at Amazon, they're definitely contributing value, but they're contributing the value of getting the boxes packed and shipped. Whereas Bezos contributed the value to consumers of having Amazon and being able to buy stuff from your own home and on the computer with overnight delivery. Those are very different values, and they actually do get paid approximately according to the value provided.
A lot of what we've been talking about, you said this to me before we started recording, Per, is to some extent rhetoric. It's using the language in a way that is understandable and persuasive to people. So we talked about the two meanings of value and how we think of it as subjective value, but that's not always how is used. It's the rhetoric of serving the consumer as opposed to exploitatively making a profit. We need to campaign for the right rhetoric for what I call the institution of entrepreneurship. We're not talking about individuals necessarily, but an entrepreneurial function and institution that creates the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people, and there's a culture of entrepreneurship we want to encourage. So just as by way of conclusion, how can we best address this issue of getting the rhetoric right and helping people with the language and avoiding the language of war and conflict and those kinds of things?
Well, I mean, the first thing would be to adopt the correct language yourself, and talk about value facilitation and think about the consumer and things like that. And I do that when I teach, and I do that in my columns for Entrepreneur Magazine and so forth. But I mean, other than that, we need to just be consistent with the message and point out that there's nothing exploitative in this. For some reason, it's intuitive for people to think that just because you have something, someone else does not. But like we covered before, there is no limitation to the profits available. There's no limitation to how much value consumers can experience. The limitation is all in our minds. So it's not the case that we have a pie and we need to just cut the pieces in a certain way. That pie is growing the more we engage with it. But we need to do that in the right way. So, I mean, those are really two different ways of viewing the economy and society and human beings too. That either it's a process where we figure out better and better ways of leading our lives and serving one another. And it's not about cutting up what is there, managing the structures and redistributing what is, because that just harms creating something new and something better.
Well, the campaign goes on, Per, and you're our leader. You're in the vanguard. We're doing our best here at Economics for Entrepreneurs and the Mises Institute, and we will, as you say, continue to campaign using the right language and try and shape and form the culture in that direction. So thank you very much indeed for today and for your leadership in this whole area. Thank you.
Thank you, Hunter.
Economics for Entrepreneurs is a production of the Mises Institute. To explore more content like this, visit Mises.org. That's MISES.org. For more from Hunter Hastings, check out hunterhastings.com.